Welcome back, everyone. It's good to be with you again. And today we're going to do another talk about the resurrection, still grounding us in some of the history and context behind Jesus' rising from the dead. So for today, we're going to put ourselves in that first century context, and we're going to become Jewish for a little bit. So let's go back to the end of the Old Testament. Typically, when we read our Bibles, we get to the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, the exile in Babylon, the return to the land, and then we skip straight on to the time of Jesus. What happened in between there? Well, a few things that I want to dwell on to help us understand the resurrection better. So the Bible as we know it was completed and compiled. The temple in Jerusalem was rebuilt. Hence, this period is called Second Temple Judaism. The Jews don't have their independence for long. They are conquered by the Greeks, who occupy them for some time and influence them with their language and their ideas, especially some ideas about the afterlife and resurrection. We'll see how important that is later. But then the Jews throw off the Greeks in the Maccabean Revolt, which is celebrated during Hanukkah, and have a period of self-rule for some time before Rome comes into the picture and occupies them. And that's where things are at the time of Jesus. So put yourself in these people's shoes for a while. They're kind of in a story without an ending. They've come back from exile and been restored to the land, but they're still occupied by foreign powers. And there's this sense of incompleteness and yearning. There's hopes for a Messiah, this messianic hope that there will be a king like David who will rule over them. They're ruled by Rome. They don't have a king. There's this apocalyptic fervor. You can kind of catch this in the book of Daniel, that the end of the age is coming, that there will be a transformation where God will restore things to how they should be. And this hope for final liberation, salvation, and renewal. But the question is, how do they get there? How do we get there? And so different groups within Judaism are trying to figure this out. They're trying to figure out how to not get destroyed by great powers like Rome, how to live faithfully, and how to bring about the final restoration of Israel. So these are some groups we'll be familiar with. First of all, you have the Sadducees. And so their hallmark is they believe that worship and sacrifice needs to be centralized in the temple. They believe in rigorous adherence to Torah and carrying out all the rituals in the temple. And so this is a reason why after the temple's destroyed in 70 AD, there are no Sadducees anymore. But the important point with them is they believe everything needs to be done in the temple and strict. Then you have the Pharisees who want to bring Torah and knowledge of God to the people throughout Israel. They don't think everyone needs to come to the temple. They are great teachers, or this is where we get the term rabbi, who bring God's instruction to the people and teach people how to follow God faithfully in their own homes, in their own cities, even if they can't come to the temple. Then you have another group known as the Essenes, who even thought the temple was corrupt and are more strict than the Sadducees. They withdrew to a community outside Jerusalem where they followed God kind of in secret in the mountains, and they had strict codes around who could be in their community. No one who is blind, no lepers, no one who is lame, no one who is ritually impure or unclean. And even though the Sadducees and others thought these could be dealt with in the temple, for the Essenes, these impurities mark you as separated from God for all time. So very strict interpretation of God's law. Then you have the Zealots, who thought that just like the Maccabees had done with the Greeks, you just needed to draw your sword, kill the Romans, and be liberated, and that would bring about God's renewal of his people. So there's another problem that all these groups are wrestling with, the matter of death. We all ultimately die, or as we say in the Old Testament, we all go down to Sheol. And so you have some groups like the Sadducees who thought that death is just the end of things. They thought that the ideas of resurrection and afterlife was too Greek, too pagan. But the Pharisees and other groups really think that if God preserves the people of Israel and Judah through slavery in Egypt, through the exile and return, will God preserve his people even through death? They thought so, based on their understanding of the goodness of God and their scriptures and their story. They thought the arrival of the end of the age would bring about the resurrection of the dead, in addition to the complete restoration of Israel and the throwing off of Rome. So to summarize, here are the three really big issues swirling around here in Jesus' time. You have the occupation by Rome and what to do about that. You have following God faithfully. Does that mean rigid adherence to Torah in the temple? What does that mean? What does that look like? What do we do with people that are ceremonially unclean and ritually impure, and people that are lame and blind? And then finally, the issue of death. What happens after death? How will God deliver his people even from death itself? And so Jesus in his life, death, and resurrection wades into all three of these things. So first, let's look at the matter of being occupied by Rome. So the cross and the resurrection are a rebuke of the powerful, violent, oppressive power of the Romans. So let's look back through the story that the Jews have up to this point. Whether it was Pharaoh and his magicians being overcome by Moses, backed by Yahweh's power, or the king in Nineveh hearing the worst sermon in the world in Jonah and repenting in sackcloth and ashes, or King Nebuchadnezzar boasting about his power before losing his mind like a wild animal. The Old Testament is full of these subversive stories of God defeating the mighty powers in unconventional or surprising ways. And therefore, Jesus' death on the cross somehow is the ultimate defeat of Rome. He rises from the dead. Even Rome's most potent tool of torture and cruel death is defeated by Jesus through the resurrection. And someone like Paul picks up on that. You look at Colossians 2:15, where Paul writes, Jesus disarmed the rulers and authorities and made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. So Jesus turns Rome's greatest weapon against them into one of the greatest symbols of our Christian faith today. And you can see this sort of resurrection power of the cross lived out today in people who oppose violent powers that are similar to Rome. You see how heroes like Martin Luther King Jr. and the people involved in the Montgomery bus boycott defied the powers even unto suffering and death. Belief in the resurrection and that God sides with the victim to confound the oppressor is an enduring trait of resurrection life. Secondly, the resurrection addresses the matter of the temple and ritual impurity and uncleanliness. So we all know during Jesus' life, he associates with and heals the impure and excluded people, the blind, the lame, the lepers, the woman subject to bleeding, and this defies the temple's monopoly on restoring people to God. This is part of the reason why the authorities are so frustrated and angry with Jesus in doing these healings. It takes away the power and authority of the temple, their power and authority, and it's frustrating what they think is the right way to please God and ultimately bring about the new age. But Jesus is showing that you don't need the temple. He's bringing people straight to him and healing them and restoring them. Then in his resurrection, Jesus replaces the temple as a sacrifice for sins and in a sense becomes the new temple himself. So one, to say Jesus is a sacrifice for sins is a way of saying that we can access God apart from the temple. We don't need to go to a temple anymore to have access to God. Hebrews 10 talks about Jesus being the once and for all sacrifice for sins, meaning that God has taken care of whatever we think separates us from him. And since Jesus is resurrected, he is an enduring temple, unlike the older temples that were destroyed ages ago. And lastly, and most interestingly and just amazingly beautifully to me, Jesus' resurrected body has wounds that make him permanently unclean. So all those things that we thought separated from us from God have been dealt with by Jesus in his resurrection. And of course, lastly, the matter of death. Jesus' resurrection constitutes a rescue from death that is greater than the Exodus, greater than the return from exile, greater than even a throwing off of Rome or other oppressive powers. It's a rescue from death itself. It's off in the future, just like many of the Jews thought, but with a twist. It's already here in a sense. Jesus has paved the way with his own resurrection. He's the first fruits and the assurance of future resurrection. So the resurrection addresses all three of these: the occupation by Rome, the matter of the exclusivity of the temple, and the finality of death. The resurrection breaks into all of those things and gives us renewed hope. And so this is the context of the resurrection where Paul and the gospel writers, the early followers of Jesus and the early church, where they come in as both faithful Jews and followers of Jesus, trying to make sense of this momentous event. So again, thank you for tuning in. Send questions or comments to Gustavo and myself, and if you want to join us next time to do some Q&A afterwards, that would be great. Thank you.